You know, one of the things that's so important today are the relationships that we have. And we can say relationships talking about friendships. That's a relationship that we have. But when I think of the word relationship, that there comes with the mindset in my mind of a man and a woman who are dating or who are married. Right. And that's what I usually and typically think about, because we've said the word friendship, and that's what we mean with our friends. But a relationship is different. It's got a deeper meaning. It's got a deeper understanding of one another. And you can have a best buddy, but there's not going to be anything close to what you're supposed to have with your spouse. Right. And what you have on that spiritual, on that physical, and on that mental level with them, because every day of your life is spent and shared with them. Right. So kind of some questions about relationships. Obviously, for single people, the goal in dating is not just to date, it's to get married. And I think we've lost that kind of mentality in the world where it's we date just to date, when we forget that dating is intended to try to see if that person is a compatible mate for life. Right. And as we think about questions about dating, you know, one of the number one problems right now with dating, not being married, but dating, is people getting pregnant out of wedlock. Mm-hmm. So what would you do if someone says, you know, if a son or a daughter came and were to say, I got my girlfriend pregnant, or I am pregnant, how do you handle that?
Yeah, obviously this is very delicate, you know, when you're talking about especially maybe teenagers. Mm-hmm. Let's begin, because we're typically thinking about young people that are getting involved in that way in relationships. And I think when you talk about relationships, you're talking about the root word there is relate, mm-hmm. to relate to, and so yes, it is typically more intimate in that way. Now there are different types of relationship, as you mentioned, but when it comes to, you know, sexual relationships out of wedlock, the Bible clearly talks about that as fornication. Mm-hmm. And so while, yes, we want to deal with this delicately as possible, ultimately we're talking about a sinful action. And so really you need to approach it as you would any other sinful action, and the goal is to help someone be restored back unto God. And so yes, people can sin, whatever that sin may be. And so we're talking about sexual sins in this segment, but you got to realize that people get involved in a way that they shouldn't be. And so let's deal with first what the Bible says about fornication, the fact that it is sin. You have Galatians 5:19, you have 1 Corinthians 6 and verse 18. There's another list that's mentioned there. Actually, there he says flee fornication. Mm-hmm. The very idea is, okay, this is a major temptation. It is one that is against the body in that way. It is one that is has a devastating effect if it's not within the bounds of marriage. Right. And so so obviously the consequence of that action very clearly pregnancy. And like you said, that is a problem. You want to reassure someone, though, that you're there to help them, that right. You're there to support them. I'm not there to judge them in a way that they're going to feel bad enough coming to you to talk to and so they need to know that they have a place where they can come and talk, where they can open up and say, look, you know, it's going to be obvious soon enough. Right. There's going to be a baby that's in the picture. So it's going to be obvious soon enough. And so they want to come and they want to get ahead of this thing and they want to talk about it. But the thing that you want to do is reassure them that while there are certain consequences to their actions, we can be forgiven. Mm-hmm. And we can have assurance in that. We can be right with God once again. Whatever decisions, though, might be made by now two parents, a male and a female that have gotten involved in this way, concerning, keeping or raising that child, or possibly even putting that child up for adoption. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when that sounded awful. But I have talked to and worked with and seen families now who cannot have children and desperately want to have children and are in a place where they can have children, but they physically can't for whatever reason. And so they want to adopt. And they want nothing more than to adopt. And so there are good, loving families out there. And so, obviously, what we don't want them to do is add sin upon sin in a way and even look at going into having an abortion or something like that. So we want to steer them clear of that, which would be yet another consequence, and the loss of life. And the taking of that life, that innocent life. So we don't want them to go down that road, but we want to spend time talking about, the sin of fornication, how that can be avoided. And I think we have to go back and have that conversation with them again. Now, whether it's our children or whether it's some other young person that we're trying to help counsel, we need to go back and help them say, look, if we don't talk about that, it's easy to fall right back into that. And that's the case that I've seen with many that have gotten into that have gotten caught up in premarital sex and come and made things right, even if they weren't pregnant. But then it's easy to, they've crossed that border before.
Right.
And so that temptation is still there, and maybe even more open to that temptation than they once ever were, knowing something about it now. Mm-hmm. I did this, maybe I didn't get pregnant.
Right.
And so having that conversation, a real conversation with young people especially, about how to avoid that kind of temptation, not falling back, be diligent. And the fact that Paul in 1 Corinthians 6 says, flee fornication, I think that tells you that this is a hard thing and you need to run as far away. We have that picture of Joseph,
Yes.
who was tempted, with Potiphar's wife and literally fled out of the house to get away from the situation. That's the picture that Paul gives in 1 Corinthians 6. Flee it, stay far away from it, run from it. And I think that's important, to have that follow-up conversation. They can be forgiven. They're going to have to deal with the consequences, and we can help and support them in that.
Right. Number one, some of the things that you touched on that I want to confirm on a little bit, talk about a little bit too. Galatians 5:19 is one of the biggest reasons that dancing would be inappropriate.
Sure.
Because it's the unchaste handling of males and females. That mentality of body against body,
right,
and moving in one as if you are one. And I've made the statement before to people who are like, well, why is dancing a problem? Would you dance that way with me?
Yeah.
Well, no, I wouldn't do. You're the preacher. I wouldn't do that. You're my friend. If you won't do that with me, then you're telling me right then that you see that there is a sexual act in the mind even,
right,
and going on here. There is something that is to be desired about it. And if you won't do that with just anybody, then you're admitting right there why dancing is wrong. Number two, the idea of fleeing fornication. Or sexual immorality, and fornication's a good term. There are certain things that are sexually immoral that I also should flee. Pornography is one of the things that these young men today, and even young women, it's not just men that are dealing with this sin. They're being taught at a young age that sex is a casual thing, and pornography is one of the biggest reasons for that. It goes about and saying, well, this is just casual, and there are many different types of things that are portrayed by pornography that are not even biblically scriptural, with an act of committing sexual acts in the way of, there's something to be said about the bedroom and being married. There's another thing to be said about sexual perversion. Yeah. And that's what a majority of pornography is, even if it's not depicted as a husband and wife, which would still be wrong to watch, but it's depicted in a lot of ways as things that are just absolutely heinous to consider. Yeah. Sexual perversion, not even intended between husband and wife, but between, like a 1 Corinthians 5 situation, where you have a man with a woman that's not supposed to be with him. Yeah. But the third thing you touched on is Potiphar's wife. Mm-hmm. I find it interesting that we're never told her name. She's spoken of entirely in a possessive sense. Yeah. She is Potiphar's wife. And I remember, not in this Bible, but a Bible I had years ago, I underlined that and I wrote next to it, why aren't we told her name? And I've started to wonder as I've pondered that question, is it because Joseph understood who she was? Right. And God's trying to make a point there. She wasn't even on the market for Joseph. Right. She was someone else's. And even if we were to say, well, then a boyfriend and girlfriend, they're not married to anybody, so it's okay. No, they belong to the Lord. Right. They don't belong to you yet. And in fact, when God created Eve in the garden, He brought Eve to Adam. Right. And He decided when Eve would become Adam's. Right. Adam didn't decide that. God gave Eve to Adam and said, I'm willing to give her to you. She is now yours. And Adam then said, this is bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She'll be called woman because she was taken out of man. And this is that mentality of our bodies belong to the Lord when we're born. They belong to the Lord when we die. But in between being born and getting married, we belong to the Lord, and we ought to treat our bodies as such. And you think we're talking about this mentality of getting pregnant out of wedlock. I want to submit that the damage that does. When you think of 2 Samuel 11, we don't have time to study it, but you just think of all the situations that happened. David was supposed to be at war and wasn't. And then he goes out onto his rooftop and he happens to look and notice Bathsheba bathing.
Right.
Now, I'm like a lot of commentators who suggest that that's probably not the first time David had seen Bathsheba. And in fact, it's probably not something that took him by surprise either. But suppose that it was. Let's just say, for sake of our illustration here, what we're talking about, that this was the first time he ever saw Bathsheba bathing. Then the sin was not seeing her, but lingering and then calling for her, which is exactly what he did. He lingered upon her. Sometimes you might enter a room that you didn't intend to enter, and there might be someone in there changing. The intent is where the sin is found.
Yeah.
If you intended to find them that way, then there's a problem. If you did an accidental walk into a room, there's no sin there. David said, bring her to me. He sleeps with her. They commit fornication, adultery, and then she's pregnant. Now that's pregnant out of wedlock.
Right.
They're not married. And think of how this story would have gone differently. Had David and Bathsheba been married, the Bible would have read something like this: and David knew Bathsheba his wife, and they bore a son, or they bore a daughter. That's how every other account is discussed when you're talking about a married couple. That's how Cain and Abel were brought into the world, because Adam knew his wife Eve. We then think about what happens as she goes to him and says, look, I'm pregnant. And then he goes into cover-up mode.
Right.
You know, that tells me right there he understood that what he had done was wrong, because he tried to cover it up. Even though he wasn't willing to admit and repent and change, he understood that what he had done was a problem, because he calls for Uriah and tries to get Uriah to go down to the house to be with his wife and to commit the act that God intends for man and woman to be able to commit together. And then, oh, look, it's your baby.
Right.
Well, that didn't work, and so then David killed Uriah. You know, nowadays we don't kill the boyfriend or the husband, we just kill the baby. And isn't that sad? Imagine if that had been how this read. We have a hard time looking at people like, you know, Hitler for what he did and the heinous acts he committed on this earth. We have a hard time looking at Haman and Esther in any good light whatsoever because of the evil that was behind it.
Right.
David did do something evil here, but I do think we'd look at it differently if he'd killed the child. If he had said to Bathsheba, look, we just need to kill the babe. David understood the sanctity of human life. But the funny thing about it, I guess you could say, is he didn't follow through with that sanctity when it came to Uriah. He decided, well, I'll kill Uriah. That's not going to be as big of a deal as killing this baby. Yeah. But nowadays, we just say, well, I'll just kill the kid. Why? You know, there's something that has been said all the time. If you can't do the time, don't do the crime.
Yeah.
Well, if a crime is something that's against the law, then sin is a crime against the law. If you are not ready and willing to be a parent, then you should not be doing the act that would make you a parent.
Right.
Even if you're married, there are people who say, well, we're just not ready yet. Well, okay. Accidents can happen sometimes. You hear of the stories of people, we got pregnant when we first got married. We weren't intending to, but it happened. Mm-hmm. That's okay, but they're married at least. They have that shared responsibility. Right. But there are many people that are getting pregnant out of wedlock, and this is an epidemic if you think about it.
Right.
I mean, I remember hearing someone say recently that their mother had taught school, and there was not a time in her last few years of teaching where there was not at least one pregnant girl in middle school or high school. I can't remember which one it was, but either way, it's still not good.
Right.
And this is a problem that we're having, and I think what we need to remember in teaching our children again is it's okay to be a kid.
Right.
It's okay to be a kid.
You don't have to grow up yet.
You don't have to grow up yet. And I think because our world, a comedian years ago talked about how every commercial is sexualized. And he talks about how you have this woman, she's in these beautiful clothing, her body's being accentuated, and then all of a sudden it goes Pepsi. You're like, well, what did that have to do with Pepsi?
Right.
Well, that's exactly what our world knows. We have heard the term sex sells. And when we have a over-sexualized world, where everything on TV, every commercial it seems is sexualized, our children grow up and think, in order for me to be accepted by this world, I have to be involved in this. But they don't.
Yeah.
Solomon said in Ecclesiastes, in much wisdom, there is much grief. Ecclesiastes 1:18. So you don't have to know everything. But going on to another question that kind of comes around, and this is a different light entirely. What would you do if your spouse, maybe your boyfriend or girlfriend, they seem to no longer be interested in you?
Well, I think when you talk about boyfriend and girlfriend, that's a different relationship, as we've already noted, than the husband and wife. So boyfriend and girlfriend, dating has an attraction. There's something that attracts and not just the physical.
Right.
There's an obvious thing that's there, not just the physical sexual attraction, but there is an attractant to get to know one another. There's something that caught the eye, or they heard something, or they thought, I'd like to get to know that person better. There's something that brought them together in that way, into that boyfriend-girlfriend situation, that relationship. Sometimes it's the case that two individuals soon realize that they're not the person that they want to spend the rest of their lives with. And you mentioned earlier, the part of the purpose in dating is to get to know for a potential spouse, to get to know one another in that way. And that never has to go into a sexual relationship until marriage. You don't have to go that far to know if this person is right for me to spend the rest of my life with. And that's something that our young people need to realize as well. The world says you try it out and see if you want it.
Like a car.
You go drive it around the block a little bit and see if that's, you can date without taking those things that far. And that needs to be taught. But what they also need to realize too is that that's okay if they're not meant to be together. And those things hurt. You get close to someone and you find out that this is not that kind of relationship. Maybe we're much better as just friends. And sometimes that can become a cliche for people. Well, we're just going to be friends. Well, you should just be friends. Right. And it's better for friends to realize maybe that going the other direction, that, hey, we've been friends. We've known each other a long time, and I respect you, and I know that you're a good person. You're pure. You want to go to heaven. That's what I'm looking for. And those are things that should be attracting for potential mates to marry. But they need to realize that that's okay. They learn through common goals and likes, and sometimes the ease of personalities and things like that. It's easy to be around that individual. That's an attractant, because sometimes people find that it's hard to be around that individual. That's not going to be a person that you're going to want to date naturally. So but they need to realize that's okay. If that's not the person, then you'll get past those feelings of hurt and disappointment and things like that. Concerning the husband and wife, that's an altogether different scenario. We can't just put aside and divorce because all of a sudden there's no interest. Somewhere along the way they lost interest. Well, how was that? And that needs to be talked about. That needs to be discussed. They can spend some time. Sometimes it requires counsel to determine what was it. It should begin first with the couple working out that relationship. I spent a great deal of time in premarital counseling talking about your time together and what you're doing, because you continue to date even on after marriage, and those things that interested you in one another, those things you build upon and continue to grow, and you find that you have other common interest, and you may find out that you grow out of this thing, even though this individual still, your spouse still loves to do this, but you're not as interested. But because they are, you have to give a little bit, and there's a constant, thing that's going on there. But and sometimes though, receiving counsel from, sometimes parents, preachers, elders, counselors, it may need to go to a more formal counseling situation, and some. But the kind of advice I'd give: remember what first attracted you to that individual, and begin there and talk about those things. And here's the second advice I would give: eliminate the distractions. Because we live fast. There's a lot of distractions, whether it be our sitting on the couch and we have this in front of us all the time, and plus the TV's going and our phone's buzzing, and so we're always checking something else, and we need to be checking one another in that way. And so spending that kind of time, that's quality time. Put away the distractions and remember what it was that first brought you together, attracted you to the individual, and you don't. Here's something else too, and this is important. You don't build that interest back up by separating. Worldly counselors all the time, you should need to try a trial separation. And look, if you're separated from one another, then you've thought the distraction was each other, but that's not the case. You take away the other things. You become a minimalist in some ways. You minimalize all the other things around and focus on your spouse. And I promise you, the interest will come back. Now, unless the person is already gone some other way. They've already put it in their mind, and they're just not willing. Sometimes that happens, and sometimes that's too late. And unfortunately, maybe even sin has occurred in some of those situations. But that doesn't have to be the case. But you'll never get that interest back by separating and being apart from one another. But rather spend time, spend it together, come together, stay together, work through those difficult times, and you'll soon find sometimes it's just a season. Sometimes, young people get married. Maybe they're even still in college, and they're busy, or they're starting their careers and they're busy, and the other distractions, sometimes it's friends or family, those kind of things, and sometimes they're starting a family, and sometimes having a new child in the home, or several children in the home. Then it becomes we're taking care of the children, and we're running here and there and everywhere to take care of the children, and we've lost focus on each other. And the first in that relationship obviously is God. And I often talk about, that first circle, though, is the husband, wife, and God.
Yes.
And then you can put another ring on that circle, and that would be your children. But that's on the outer part of that. The inner part of that is that couple, that husband and wife, and that's important. Work on that, and you'll build the interest back.
Yeah, because when we vow on our wedding days, we don't vow to our children. There shouldn't be any children in a marriage unless there's something that's happened where a spouse has died and there's already children present. But we don't vow in a typical marriage of a single girl and a single guy, first marriage they're ever getting married to. The intention is you're going to be together for life, and we don't vow to our children. We don't even know if they're going to be any children. We vow to each other.
Yeah.
And that has to be remembered, especially when children come into play.
Sure.
That our children are important, but like you said, they're not on the big picture circle as far as it needs to be us.
They're not number one.
And the children need to fall in line where they belong, which is behind your spouse and behind your husband or behind your wife. You love them, you provide for them, you take care of them, but they don't become the central focus. And I think one of the things that's so interesting that needs to be touched on is we need to understand when it comes to boyfriend and girlfriend, like we've mentioned, it's dating to get married.
Right.
And if you're losing interest in one another as a boyfriend and girlfriend, then that's okay.
Yeah.
But there's two things that need to be understood. Don't just get married to try to fix it.
Yeah.
If you think, well, I'll just marry her or I'll marry him and that'll fix it, it may not. And the second thing is, if you do indeed break up, be a Christian.
Right.
Be a Christian. We don't need any more hatred in the Lord's church between its own members. And especially if you're dating a non-Christian, I would say this is important and crucial. If you are a Christian dating a non-Christian, and perhaps you might even teach them the gospel, and I know of a situation where a girl met a man or met a guy, and they got together and dated, and then they broke up. Well, he's still a faithful member of the church.
Yeah.
It's important, though, because I also know of situations where that individual was become a member of the church. Then the girl or the guy broke up with him in such a horrible fashion, they left the Lord's church because they got a bad taste in their mouth for how that person could treat them that way. Mm-hmm. We need to remember to be a Christian. I guess the final thing that needs to be talked about, though, is when your son or daughter comes to you and says, Mom, Dad, it's time. I'm ready. I've met this girl. I've met this man. We're in love. I remember Father of the Bride. Yeah. I watched that movie growing up with my dad, and it was the 22-year-old daughter saying, Dad, I met a man and we're getting married. But he heard it as the 3-year-old little girl saying, Daddy, I met a man and he's wonderful and we're getting married. And he had to blink and kind of massage his eyes open like, did I really just see what I think I saw? Yeah. And so we get that kind of hard mindset of, oh man, my child's wanting to get married. What would you do if they were to say that to you?
Well, just recently went through this, obviously. We have a sit down. We talk. And for me, it was my son who came to me and said, we're talking about this and we think we're ready to get married, So we talk about what it means to be ready, and not just questions about finances. Sometimes that's where we jump our focus. Well, you're not ready because you don't have a job, and you're not, and maybe some that plays into that. Obviously, you need to be able to support. But here's the thing. I asked this question. Why are you thinking about this? What spurred you to think about this? What is it at this point in time that's brought you to me to say, we think we're ready, we are ready, or why are you telling me we're ready? What spurred that on? And I asked this question: is there any pressure to do that? Right. Is there something that's pressuring you? Is your potential spouse pressuring you in that way? Could you wait?
Right.
That's a question. Could you wait? and that may have to do, with the fact that even what Paul would talk about, burning in their lust, and the fact that he says, then you should be married, but not just the idea. Some will take that and say, okay, well, yeah, but we're thinking about those things, so we must be ready, and we need to do this, But maybe you're not there yet. Maybe you need to take away the temptation to do those things and to be a part of that. These questions are there just to and the questioning is not my judgment that you're not, but just simply want my son or daughter, or want a young person to think through those things, and to tell if they can explain to me why. This is their opportunity to convince me why, and I'm going to listen to them. Sometimes parents judge or jump to judgment and immediately say, "You're absolutely not." No, absolutely not, and then shut them down wanting to listen. And sometimes that's, sometimes we rebel when we've been rejected in that way. And so talk through those things with them. Help them to understand God's plan for marriage, I think, is key in that. And make sure they get premarital counseling from a Christian source. That is, I think that has helped so many families. It helped me. And understanding it from a Christian perspective, understanding what God's idea of marriage is, what His plan for marriage is, what the Bible says, and the authority on it, and stay there. That way, I know this is for our life on earth. This is what we're going to do. We're going to be married. This is it when we make this decision. And so make sure that they have a good understanding about sex and God's view of it. Make sure that it's not some skewed prudish view of it, because sometimes people run the far other direction of it, and that causes problems in that relationship. They have to work through some of those things. But enjoy that relationship that's there, and know that they can enjoy that relationship with one another.
Right. I think the thing to remember and to first of all notice is in Matthew 19 and verse 6, Jesus says, they've come together, they've become one flesh. He's kind of recounting what happened in Genesis. Yeah. But then he adds something that we don't find in the book of Genesis. He says, therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. And that's the first thing I remember my parents asking me is, what if y'all aren't compatible in 10 years? That's a huge question to ask. Absolutely. Because if you're not ready, then you're going to say, well, I guess I don't know what we'll do in 10 years. The question needs to be answered this way. We're going to make it work.
Yeah.
We're going to, like you said, maybe a season of our life, we're going to make it work. But then you got to think about the great responsibility that is told, and I know it's part of the punishment of mankind because of the sin that we had in the Garden of Eden, but God said to the people that were present, Adam and Eve, I'm going to greatly multiply your sorrow. I'm going to make you, Adam, you're going to till the ground for your food now. You're going to have to work to provide. And if your family's going to eat, you're going to have to do it. And that's got to be something we understand. Absolutely. There are a lot of men right now that are not men. They're men by their age, but not by their maturity. Yeah. And so when we think about that maturity that has to come around, we've got to ask ourselves, are you ready to provide for your wife, for your future children? If you are not, are you really ready? Yeah. I don't know that you would be, but these relationships are so important to be considering and to ask ourselves, how can we better ourselves in our relationships today?
The home is that important.
Yeah.
So, yeah.